the point that was brought out very clearly is that smart grid has a role, and a very, very important role in most of the programs of the Government of India. And also the point that was brought out is that there is a business opportunities for the DISCOM. I think that will help us to sell the smart grid idea to the DISCOM if they can see value in that. So now I welcome Dr. Amory Lovins to make his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. India's electricity system faces great challenges and immense opportunities. I'm grateful for the honor to share with you, the real experts in this field, some thoughts and evidence about how to overcome the challenges and exploit the opportunities so that India's electricity system can provide secure, clean, and affordable electricity for all, forever. Working with over 100 electricity providers and scores of governments in the past 4 decades in about 65 countries, I've learned a little that I'll try to apply to India's extraordinary diversity and complexity. And if I get some details wrong, I beg your forgiveness and instruction, and hope you will nonetheless search for any underlying truths that might be of value. Now, to design a secure, clean, and affordable electricity system for India, we first need a deeper understanding of how much electricity the people and enterprise of India will actually need to deliver the services they want, at least cost. So let me ask your indulgence in exploring that question for roughly the first half of my remarks, because how much electricity we need will change how much of what kinds of supply we build. Some 70% of the generators projected to run in 2030 odd have yet to be built. Will we really need them all? Electricity is in a time of revolutionary change on the demand and supply side. Thomas Edison's incandescent lamps, for example, got 11-fold more efficient, but it took 130 years. Better new lamps slowly followed. Then, like a thunderbolt, came white LEDs, each decade getting 30 times more efficient, 20 times brighter, 10 times cheaper. So they're going to save most of the 1/7 of global electricity now used for lighting. What else changes this fast? LEDs turn electricity into light. Photovoltaics, PVs, are the same thing backwards. They turn light into electricity. And in the past 5 years, their meteorite strike has fatally disrupted utilities by making solar power cost less than the fossil fuels we feed into thermal power stations. That's, for the United States, the dashed lines at the bottom. And wind power, the lower aqua curve, is now so cheap that it often makes old coal, gas, and nuclear plants shut down as uneconomic just to operate. Renewable energy supply is, of course, a fungible, competitive global commodity. So the January solar auction in Rajasthan yielded 4.34 rupees per kilowatt hour, about $60 a megawatt hour. That's cheaper than recently auctioned projects using imported coal. Soon it's competitive with domestic coal. But then in February, the Peruvian auction discovered unsubsidized prices of under $48 a megawatt hour for photovoltaics, 38 for wind. In India, wind power prices will surely fall toward those levels with fully competitive auctions, and India's offshore potential will probably raise the wind resource by about tenfold to several terawatts. Now, as modern renewables and efficiency enjoy such market success, Niti Aayog's energy advisor, Anil Jain, I had the honor to meet yesterday, wisely noted last August that a clean and efficient scenario can actually cost less over time than a traditional one. And he also rightly noted that earlier assessments had proven so conservative that solar power goals for India just got tenfold bigger and 10 years sooner. It took a year. Yet most Indian experts think India has only a modest potential for energy efficiency. All 4 of the main studies compared in a CPR YASA meta-study found that the 2030 efficiency potential was in the narrow range of just 30 to 34% savings. So let me ask you, if India's potential for energy efficiency were examined with the same rigor and vigor and ambition as its just radically revised plans for solar power, and were executed with the same remarkable success as the past year's improvements to the coal system, would we still get this same answer, or perhaps a very different one that could give renewable power a larger share sooner? Now, only 3 of 7 major Indian analyses were said to comprehensively discuss efficiency potential, but by international standards, it wasn't at all comprehensive, and it was very conservative technically. Niti Aayog refers to efficiency and renewables adoption at 4 levels, of which the 2 highest are called determined efforts and heroic efforts. But might India be able to deliver the same services with the same or better quality and reliability by using several-fold less electricity, several-fold more productively? Might this incur much lower capital cost and total cost than existing scenarios, reinforcing that lesson from Mr. Jain's first quotation? So for what I will a bit cheekily call a balanced effort scenario, because it chooses the best buys first, let me offer you some guesses that are not built on a real India-specific analysis. That remains to be done. But let me explain why, based on experience and analysis elsewhere, these guesses in the bottom line of the chart seem to me far from implausible. Now, both developed and developing economies can deliver energy services much more efficiently. Developing economies typically waste less in absolute terms, but waste more in percentage terms. They have lower technical efficiency, but greater need and opportunity to improve it. And a fast-moving economy like yours has the greatest need to measure its success by results, not means, and to avoid overbuilding supply. It may seem crazy to talk about overbuilding in India, but let me remind you that this year, China is deauthorizing most or all of 200 gigawatts of previously approved but now unneeded coal plants, which now look like pre-stranded assets. And just in the past year, India swung from coal shortages to record coal stockpiles. So I know it's hard to imagine, but with renewables likely to produce most of India's new capacity additions in the next 5 years, and grid losses falling fast, efficient use could, together with those, tip the power system into unaccustomed surplus sooner than we might imagine. I've seen this happen in many other countries. Now, if total primary energy use in the United States had grown with the economy at the 1975 level of intensity, the US would have used this much energy, but we actually cut that by more than half. And meanwhile, total renewable output doubled, and yet its cumulative impact was 31 times less than the savings. Each year now, we get brisk growth in renewables, but savings add 3 times more. They just don't get the headlines because the electricity we don't use is invisible. Now, no energy company foresaw this development, and none today fully foresees efficiency's continuing expansion as the low-hanging fruit keeps growing back faster than we can pick it. What of the future? Well, in 1975, US government and industry all insisted that the energy needed to make $1 of real GDP could never go down. So it was quite heretical when a year later I suggested it could drop 67% in 50 years. So far, it's dropped 54% in 39 years, and yet just the innovations that have already happened in far more powerful technologies and design methods, enlightened regulation, maturing financing and marketing and delivery channels, can now, we know, save another 3-fold, twice what I originally thought, at 1/3 the real cost. And 5 years on, even that now looks conservative. So we're starting to follow General Eisenhower's wise advice to make tough problems soluble, not by chopping them into smaller bits, but by expanding their boundaries to include everything the solution requires. All four energy-using sectors, transport, buildings, industry, and electricity, save more energy sooner together than separately. They have important interactions that most models don't capture. For example, smart electric vehicles, which we now know how to deploy rapidly and affordably, can provide valuable distributed storage and ancillary services and flexibility to the electric grid, so it can more easily integrate variable renewables. Moreover, all four kinds of innovation, not just technology but also design, not just public policy but also new business strategy, can combine to create deeply disruptive game changers that can leapfrog national development. These synergies first emerged 5 years ago in this detailed business book. Reinventing Fire showed how the United States could by 2050 need no oil, no coal, no nuclear energy, a third less natural gas, using tripled efficiency and quintupled renewables to run a 2.6-fold bigger economy, emitting about 84% less carbon, costing $5 trillion less in net present value, counting all externalities at zero, and needing no new inventions and no acts of Congress, but enabled and sped by smart subnational policies in mindful markets. This transition could be led by business for profit. And of course, on the electric side, the backbone of this is that 3/4 of our electricity in the US powers buildings, 1/4 industry, and we found the buildings could triple or quadruple their energy productivity, saving $1.4 trillion net present value with a 33% internal rate of return. So the savings are worth 4 times their costs. Industry could also accelerate and double its energy productivity with a 21% IRR. And the US is roughly on this path without a coherent national energy policy. The first 5 years of this 40-year journey are on track broadly. The primary energy intensity, the electric intensity, are falling with the correct slope at about a 1-year lag. And this is happening not because national policy said so, but because the private sector smells the $5 trillion on the table. Now, this ambitious grand synthesis for the United States now has a Chinese counterpart, a similar effort by about 54 Chinese and American experts over the past 2.5 years. It'll be published in the next few weeks. And this roadmap developed for the Chinese government is the most detailed, rigorous, empirically grounded, economically explicit one yet done for China. It offers quite an instructive model for developing countries, and many of us are wondering, what would it look like in India? Now, China is the world's biggest carbon emitter, energy user, coal user, but its paramount leaders a 1.5 years ago called for a revolution, not a word the party uses lightly, in the production and consumption of energy. And meanwhile, we'd assembled 4 organizations to write that revolution's roadmap for the maximum practical and profitable deployment of efficiency and renewables. Our customers included key energy authors of the just approved 13th 5-year plan. So the top energy modelers of China's Economic Development and Reform Commission used their best models, data, and examples, 120 case studies, to help inform the new 5-year plan. And here's what they found. That China could run a 6.9-fold bigger economy in 2050 than in 2010, using about the same primary energy as today. This 7-fold gain in energy productivity could come both from technical efficiency and from structural shifts in the composition of output, plus the transition from thermal to renewable power. And meanwhile, supply would become over half non-fossil, increasing carbon productivity 12-fold by 2050. The coal burn would fall about 60%, or closer to 80% in the power sector. The net present value cost of this whole transition is about 22 trillion renminbi, or $3.7 trillion lower than business as usual. So just as Mr. Jain said, the NITI Aayog scenario tools are starting to show the efficient and clean scenario for China can cost less, not more. And the carbon emissions would fall about 2/5 below current levels. Conventional air pollution would go down 85 or 90% before cleaning up the fuels or the abatement technologies. In the electricity sector, the 6.9-fold bigger GDP would require less than a doubling of 2015 electricity use, although most of the savings would then be reused to electrify autos and some industrial processes. So coal use plummets as non-fossil technologies take over 83% of generation. Saving that much electricity could be an especially powerful macroeconomic lever for Indian development because of its hidden capital leverage. Investing to make in India the electricity-saving technologies could cut by about 10,000-fold the capital needs of the most capital-intensive sector, the power sector, which gobbles a quarter of global development capital, and thus turn the power sector from a black hole for capital into a net exporter of capital to fund other development needs. So for both the US and China, and also in Europe, the most rigorous and detailed studies to date show that to solve the energy problem, we just need to enlarge it and integrate it across sectors. And the results may at first seem incredible, but as Marshall McLuhan said, only puny secrets need protection. Big discoveries are protected by public incredulity. Now, India, of course, differs greatly from China in many, many ways, but like Hanuman in the Ramayana, we sometimes need to be reminded of our special powers before we can do amazing things. So a visitor to India observes certain special powers that India has, at least comparable depth of smart, resourceful, very skilled people, profoundly entrepreneurial society, ambitious and action-oriented national leadership, decentralized union structure promoting local initiatives and diverse experiments, the ability to leapfrog to the latest best global practice. Having built only perhaps a third of the infrastructure, half as much as China, there's more opportunity in India to build right now, more easily than fixing later. And also, I think you've got a potentially energy surplus country disguised as an energy deficit country. That is, you have immense solar resources, 2 or 3 terawatts of cost-effective wind resources, including offshore, and huge efficiency potential. So what can Indian ingenuity do to correct pervasive energy inefficiency? Let me select just 6 examples. I'm consciously going to omit some very important ones, such as how to triple the efficiency of cooking pots, how to improve the uniform quality of steel and cement. But let me just pick 6 that come right to mind. First of all, Rohan Parikh, I think, is with us today. And he led a team at Infosys that built every quarter a 22,000 square meter office building using 4/5 less energy than the Indian norm, and with 10 or 20% lower construction cost, but superior comfort and satisfaction. I visited these buildings, and even this initial prototype, competing his design on one side with conventional on the other, used 3/4 less energy than the median US office. It worked better and has improved continuously ever since. So his later standard designs reduced cooling capacity by 60%, 2,000 fewer tons for 1 million square feet, by successively improving building envelope, lighting design, plug loads, aircon, and right-size, not over-designed specifications. Some innovations are as simple as the 100% at midday, 90% at the beginning and end of the day daylighting, beautifully done, shown on the right, and the daylight was delivered without glare because of a simple rule Rohan put in place that if the workers complained that they wanted blinds, the architect wouldn't get paid. Very effective. Now, as many large office buildings at Infosys are 4 or 5 times more efficient than normal Indian practice, but they're more comfortable, and they work out about 10 to 15% less costly to construct, whereas the official forecasts assume that buildings only about half this efficient, EPI 105 to 170, would cost 10 or 15% more to build. He's getting the opposite result. Notice on the right in red the percentage reductions in these parameters, carefully measured. Just the reduced peak electric load in a big new office building saves not only about 95 rupees a square foot in annual electricity, it also saves upfront about 250 rupees a square foot of capital in the mechanical and electrical systems. So, of course, all the saved OpEx drops straight to the bottom line, not even counting the saved capital costs. Infosys already saved $100 million, 660 crore, straight to the bottom line by cutting OpEx, cutting the electric consumption per employee by 46% in 7 years. The savings also included retrofits, earning a 30% IRR on a 19 megawatt saving, 2011 to 14. For example, just re-engineering the chiller plant saved 30% on energy, 45% equipment costs or count, 25% space, 2.5-year payback. Making the roofs white on 2.5 lakh square meters paid back in 2 years. So the new retrofit targeted emphasis is an EPI of 80 or 90, compared with the typical office now around 250. And yet official projections in India hardly include retrofits. Now, such efficiency does require what Rohan brought to this effort, namely unreasonably ambitious but severely practical goals, strong leadership, innovative design, meticulous attention to detail, careful measurement, and data-driven operations. But on India's 10 billion square feet of new commercial space just by 2030, this could save at least 45 gigawatts at peak demand. By the way, they also do very well with water and waste savings. Now, how could we do this? Well, to encourage developers, government could raise or lower the floor area ratio based on the measured efficiency of your previous building. Or, to connect a new building or major renovation to the grid and other public services, you could pay a fee or get a rebate, which and how big depending on how efficiently the building uses those services. Building standards are obsolete before the ink is dry, and they give no incentive to do better, but this sort of fee-bait, a combination of a fee and a rebate, drives continuous improvement. We also know that design professionals perform much better if they're rewarded for savings, not expenditures. Buildings could be labeled with their measured efficiency, just like restaurant health inspections, and local governments could simply allow all super efficient new buildings to go to the head of the queue for any required approvals. It costs government nothing, but for developers, time is money. Now, how about households? Modern Book of buildings are seldom as climate responsive as Indian standards invite. Niti Aayog's forecasting tool says the 2047 residential cooling load will only differ about 17% between slight and heroic adoption of improved building envelopes. So the improvements must be quite modest. But a design as sophisticatedly simple as this one by Dinur Tandani, convectively vented double wall, that sustained 6 to 12 Celsius degrees of passive cooling at an extra cost around 2%. And the 2 million square feet built here just before the turn of the century kept the inner wall dry and mold-free through the monsoon, so they were very popular. The architect Karan Grover, with whom I dined the other night, routinely achieves 11 Celsius passive cooling by other methods. And if you then have a proper 3 or 3.5 meter ceiling height, a good ceiling fan adds another 5 degrees of comfort range. So add airtight fiberglass casements, windows coated to block heat, better interior cross ventilation, and you have pretty good comfort, really harnessing in Puka buildings the millennia of passive design experience that can provide surprising comfort even in Kacha buildings just before the monsoon, as I've experienced. Moreover, the best air conditioners officially assumed for 2047 are only half as efficient as the best now on the market. Of the 150 gigawatts of new peak load expected from urban households' aircon by 2030, modern and well-enforced efficiency standards could easily save at least 40 gigawatts, and a factory-installed smart chip could make the rest of the load dispatchable, financed on bill, like India's excellent bulk-purchased LEDs. In fact, this huge demand response is so valuable that smart super-efficient aircon units may be worth giving away. Now, other appliances in the household. Today's best market technologies can cost-effectively make ceiling fans over twice as efficient as the Indian norm, refrigerators 7-fold, television 6-fold. Samsung now does a 22-inch color television using 10 watts, permitting a home package of a nice color television, 4 LED lamps, a radio, and a mobile phone charger, all drawing 18 watts DC total. So you run it off one 27-watt PV panel at half the total system cost of the standard approach. And this package, by the way, from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab is now being exhibited at the US Embassy in Delhi. Um, Now, if you had efficient and ratcheting ambitious standards like Japan's Top Rudder program, you could greatly accelerate energy access, give India a lead in the global export market for these super efficient appliances, and avoid just in the top 10 household uses about 100 gigawatts of new electric supply. Agriculture. The pumping uses about 90% of India's water withdrawals, $10 billion a year in subsidies. There's 1.8 crore electric irrigation pumps using 19% of the nation's electricity. The connected load is officially 100 gigawatts. It's probably more like 150 in reality. The pumps are generally inefficient, poorly controlled, run on free or subsidized power to deliver water that's two-thirds pumped from groundwater and mostly wasted. And even among the 9.3 crore smallholders growing over half the farm output, even those on the grid are often power deprived. But the inefficient irrigation strains the grid capacity, limits new connections, encourages theft, is worsened by theft, and it starves the discoms for revenue. The diesel pumping is even worse. So some Indian entrepreneurs are offering a compelling value proposition, sometimes integrated with the 4+ lot telecom towers. And some new business models double or triple the motor pump system efficiency. They can dispatch demand response, they can dispatch surplus power back to the grid, so the farmer has a good year-round revenue source. And over time, this can cut in half the cost of serving the agricultural customers, so the discom can reinvest in greater access and more connections. The state saves half the cost, the farmer needn't contribute, pays a rational tariff around 4 rupees for actual usage, the developer puts up the capital for pumping and control infrastructure and the PV, the grid's better utilized, and even more cost could be saved by reducing pipe friction, by bundling solar pumping with drip irrigation, still under 5% of Indian irrigation, but almost all of it is at 10 times the pressure that a smallholder needs. Drip can also shrink the PV system, so you can irrigate 1 hectare from groundwater in suction range, not with 2 kilowatts of solar, but with 600 watts, proven in Gujarat, and perhaps by the end of this year, 400 watts for a 1-year system payback to the farmer. And that is before you add cheap sensors to measure the water needed in the root zone and to optimize the net cash per drop, not just the crop per drop. So you go from commodities like wheat to high-value off-season fruits, spices, vegetables, even adding more value like distilling mint oil instead of selling mint leaves, not counting the ability to quintuple output from fish ponds as another byproduct of this system. And I think the policy dream here, which is not unrealistic, is that the 5- to 7-fold water and pumping efficiency could be phased in as the subsidies are phased out. So you would end up with the correct price. The farmer would pay no more. The subsidy would be unnecessary, $10 billion a year to invest in other things you need. Now, motors are India's biggest user of electricity, and almost every motor system can be significantly and profitably improved. The most comprehensive analysis of that potential I led 20 years ago found 35 motor system opportunities just between the meter and the input shaft of the driven machine. And if you buy the correct 7 of those 35 measures first, the other 28 become free byproducts, and you save about 3 times more electricity at a 1/5 the unit cost compared to the standard 2 improvements of better motors at variable speed. Now, pumps and fans use about half the motor power, and they offer dramatic further savings that I'll mention later. And I want to give, as is my 6th example, a high-tech case. We design a lot of chip fabs and data centers. Let me look for a minute at a data center with you. If you put 100 watts of coal into the power plant, perhaps 30 will end up at your meter, and of that, maybe half will actually get to the servers, the rest being lost in uninterruptible power supplies and cooling systems that are half the capex. Maybe half of what gets to the server gets to the chips because of dreadful power supplies at part load and a lot of fans to take heat that largely shouldn't be there off the motherboard into the room where we can do dumb things with it. And then most of the computing resources are dramatically underutilized. This little stalk is getting so small it's about to vanish, so let's magnify it. Next problem is bloatware, a lot of processes and threads going on that we don't really want or need. And then we may even have inefficient business processes downstream of that. Well, when you've got such a chain of compounding losses, the best way to save is starting at the downstream end, turn them around backwards into compounding savings. So first, we write elegantly terse code, can be very well made in India. And I used to think that was a tenfold saving on compute cycles if we make each one needed and wanted, but actually it turns out to be about 100-fold. That's how bad the bloatware is. Then we can make the servers at least 4 times more efficient, better nowadays. Then we need much less cooling and power supply, and there are smarter ways to do that. And then we can even have the utility loss by doing fuel cell trigeneration. Now, the best such system we've designed, EDS told us, can save about 90 to 100% of cooling energy with better comfort, lower capex, higher uptime. And by the way, our new office is not the last word. This one in Germany is claimed to use 2/5 as much energy as ours does. So its rooftop solar cells make nearly 5 times the electricity used by all 3 stories, implying that maybe you could run a 15-story building powered just by solar on the roof without even the walls and windows. Let's find out how this works in India. And as for medium and high-rise apartments, here are some examples built or being built in hot, humid US cities for low or very low income people. And all of these buildings produce more energy than they use. And they all have a sound business case. Now, I live in a different climate, almost a Himalayan climate, at 2,200 meters elevation near Aspen, Colorado, where it used to go as low as minus 44 Celsius. But a third of a century ago, this house helped inspire over 40,000 European passive buildings that, like ours, have no heating system, don't need it, and have about normal construction costs, and they can look like whatever you like. Now, let's go into the central atrium towards the right, under super windows that insulate like 16 sheets of glass. And inside, we've so far grown 62 banana crops with no furnace. In 1984, this house was saving 99% of its space and water heating energy, 90% of the electricity, half the water, all with a 10-month payback. Today's technologies, which we've retrofitted, are so much better that our lights and appliances seem to use less electricity than their monitoring equipment. And the integrative design gives many benefits from each expenditure. So the white arch holding up the middle of my house has 12 functions, but it has only 1 cost. What about hot, humid climates? Well, this house was built on similar design principles in Bangkok, and it turns out to save 90% of the aircon energy with exactly normal construction cost and superior comfort. I dare say about everybody in India lives in a climate somewhere between Bangkok and Old Snowmass, Colorado. Now, industry uses half the world's and half of India's energy, and just in the United States, industry, we found, could save $500 billion worth of energy. Dow Chemical already has returned over $9 billion saving on a $1 billion efficiency investment, but there's much more to do. For example, industry owns most of the motors that use 3/5 of the world's electricity, and half that motor power runs pumps and fans. But integrative design made a typical industrial pumping loop use at least 86% less energy, not by getting better pumps and motors and controls, but just by replacing long, thin, crooked pipes with fat, short, straight pipes, also shrinking the pumping equipment and the total capital cost. So this isn't a new technology. This is rearranging our metal furniture as designers. Doing this to all the world's pump and fan systems would save half the coal-fired electricity in the world, with payback typically under a year on retrofit and less than 0 in new build. So for the electricity that's 3/5 used in motors, from the coal burnt at the power plant to flow out the pipe, there are so many compounding losses that only a tenth of the energy actually comes out as flow. But every unit of flow or friction we save in the pipe, starting at the downstream end, compounds back to save 10 units of fuel cost, pollution, and global weirding back at the power plant, whilst the equipment gets smaller and the capex goes down. And we see this ignored in practically every building and factory, including in India. We lay pipes out like this instead of like this, more friction. At a museum in California, our colleague Peter Rumsey, who helped so much with the emphasis work, retrofitted an efficient layout into the condenser water pumping loop. He cut the pumping energy by 3/4 with a 2 or 3 month payback and eliminated 15 pumps that will never again waste electricity and maintenance. And then when he repiped the chilled water loop and added variable speed drive, he doubled the flow and saved 85% of the energy. So to help the pipe fitters understand how to minimize friction, he simply asked them to lay out the supply pipes as if they were drains. And this is therefore how he changes the layout coming back from a cooling tower to a chiller. And everything gets better: less space, less weight, less noise, less friction, less energy, fewer parts, smaller equipment, less installation labor, less maintenance, higher uptime. The only thing in the way is force of habit. And by combining these and many other forms of integrative design, my team's latest $40 billion worth of very diverse industrial redesigns have typically found about 30 to 60% energy savings on retrofits, paying back in 2 or 3 years, and in new build around 40 to 90% savings with almost always lower capex. I would be very surprised if India didn't have at least comparable potential, little of which is in your demand forecast yet. Now, of course, the more efficiency we buy, the more electricity demand slows and even reverses. Here's what happened to the Australian forecasts as the actual demand went down, even as the economy grew. Part of this is through rooftop solar, which counts as a negative load. So maybe a fifth of the 2020 revenue of these electric suppliers just went away. And China, of course, has cut its coal burn the past 2 years, even as the economy grew, now finds about 200 gigawatts of coal plants in surplus that will get canceled. So before any overshoot, this is the right time to make sure India's electricity is right-sized and has a durable business model. Because when Thomas Edison was inventing this industry, he did not sell electricity, he sold light. He would charge you 1 cent to run a lamp for an hour, because he knew as an inventor that lamps would get more efficient. So when that happened, he wanted to get more profit by having lower cost of delivering light. They overruled him in 1892 and started selling kilowatt hours, so customer efficiency reduced revenue rather than reducing cost. And we've all been making the same mistake ever since, selling a commodity when what the customers want is a service or an infrastructure. So I think India's electricity providers would find this an apt time to seek the regulatory change that we've done in about half the US for electricity or gas or both. It's called decoupling and shared savings, and it rewards the discoms for cutting your bill, not for selling you more energy, so that the providers and customers' interests are fully aligned. Amidst all the changes happening in the electricity business, the deepest one is how the information age informs and enables and organizes customers to take power into their own hands and become the prosumers mentioned this morning. It is generally smart to sell customers what they want before someone else does, and customers are figuring out they can buy fewer electrons, use them more productively and timely, produce their own, and even share them with others. In Holland, they can buy electricity from fellow customers through this this website called Van de Bron, from the source, that's rather like a music file swapping site, but it's for buying your electricity at different prices from different people, shows how much you'll save every month. And a utility executive we know bought from the guy in the upper left because he really liked that cute piglet. Well, at Christmas, he then got a long handwritten Christmas card from his electricity supplier. What utility can hope to compete with that level of customer intimacy? And in India, as around the world, the modern renewables, in a graph I showed earlier, are taking over the market: wind, utility scale solar. And in India, you could accelerate these price drops even further If home loans could include solar costs, if net metering were standard, and if hookup rules captured the security benefit of distributed generators by making the default design resilient, so the solar power or other distributed source can work with or without the grid. Now, you're all familiar, I think, with the halved forecast capacity additions from Bloomberg. From fossil and nuclear plants, not even counting their bigger retirements, cost renewable growth doubles. We're actually well beyond this target, 25 gigawatts over it just for wind and PV last year, $329 billion global investment. And China in 2013 alone added more photovoltaic capacity than the US had added since developing it in 1954. China for the past 3 years, India for the past 2 or 3 years, has produced more wind power than nuclear power. Rising India's renewable markets could drive even faster growth. And of course, bypassing power companies the way mobile phones bypassed wireline phone companies with no money down or cash back installation by third parties, that gives electricity executives nightmares and venture capitalists sweet dreams. Now, if you then put a bit of battery behind the meter, producing 13 forms of value, you can time shift production. So in 5 US locations, 2014 through 2050, for residential on the left, commercial on the right, you can see in the colored bars the fraction of electricity that can be more cheaply provided from your rooftop PVs without net metering. That means the utility revenues could cut in half in the 2020s, and Tesla's battery price just moved this 3 years to the left. Now let's add a third disruptor, flexible demand. In Hawaii, 1/8 of the homes are solar powered. Hundreds have cost effectively dropped off the grid, buying batteries as well. And a typical household in a 24-hour day uses appliances at various times. About half the load is under the solar curve in yellow. But now the utility there wants to confiscate any extra solar output, not pay for it. So the customers will logically get smart appliances and move 80 or 90% of their load under the solar curve, thereby losing most of the utility's windfall and its ordinary revenue. So anti-solar tariffs of this sort turn out to be well-aimed boomerangs that actually accelerate and expand solar adoption. And like IT, cheaper renewables feed on themselves. The cheaper they get, the more we buy, so they get cheaper, so we buy more. We're used to big plants, thermal plants that take many years to design and build, but meanwhile, with roughly similar capital, we can buy each year a photovoltaic factory that each year thereafter produces enough solar modules to produce each year thereafter as much electricity as the thermal plant will produce. 10 years in, you're already a factor 15 ahead on solar output. So that's why solar is globally scaling faster than cell phones. But many Indian experts assume that major growth in renewables will require bulk storage of electricity. And actually, we do have not just that one way, but 9 ways to make the grid more flexible so it can reliably accommodate wind and photovoltaics variability. So here's a purely conceptual and schematic sketch of the supply curve of those flexibility resources. Of course, details will differ. We are often told, though, that only coal, gas, and nuclear plants can keep the lights on because they're 24/7, whilst wind power and photovoltaics are variable and thus supposedly unreliable. But let me explain why neither part of that statement is true. First, variable does not mean unpredictable. Here's how accurately the French grid operator in a stormy winter month forecast a day ahead in blue the actual output of the country's wind farms in green. I'll bet they wish they could forecast demand that accurately. Also, the reason we built the grid is that no generator is 24/7. They all break. When a big plant fails, you lose maybe 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often for weeks or months, often without warning. So grids are built to handle and do routinely handle that intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, grids can handle the forecastable variations of solar and wind power by backing up those variable renewables, mainly with other renewables of other kinds or in other places. So highly renewable power can come from a portfolio of largely or wholly renewable sources when they are forecasted integrated, and diversified by both type and location, obviously with a stronger and well-functioning grid. Now let me illustrate this with an example from Texas, which has no big hydropower, almost none of any kind. It's isolated from the rest of the United States. It's a rather difficult case, and it has rather an Indian set of climates. Now, the expected summer weekly load shape in 2050 might look like this, 50-odd, 60 gigawatts, getting smaller, maybe 30-odd gigawatts, and less peaky with efficient use. Now let's do all of this with renewables. We'll install enough wind and photovoltaics to make 86% of the annual electricity, get the other 14% from dispatchable renewables, geothermal, small hydro, solar thermal electric, biogas burnt in existing gas turbines, burning obsolete energy studies, that's my favorite. And then we've got 100% renewable supply, but you see it's not a great match to the load shape. We have both surpluses and deficits. So let's take the surpluses and put them into two kinds of distributed storage that are worth buying regardless, namely ice storage air conditioning and smart charging of electric vehicles, both fully deployed by 2050. Then we can recover that energy when needed, fill the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand. We're now 100% renewable reliably every hour of the year with only 5% left over to be spilt. So the economics will be very good. And this is not just theoretical. We've all heard that Germany was over a quarter last year, actually 33% renewably powered. Italy 33, Ireland 20, Britain 19. But I want to call to your attention, there are 4 other European countries with modest or no hydropower that got about half their electricity consumption from renewables in 2014. They added no bulk storage. They had superior reliability. For Denmark and Germany, 10 times that of America. The former East German ultra-reliable utility, 50 Hertz, got 49% of all its electricity last year from wind and PV. So the operators have gradually learned to run these grids the way a conductor leads a symphony orchestra. No instrument plays all the time, but together the orchestra continuously produces beautiful music. And this could work rather well in India because your main renewables are complementary. The monsoons weaken solar but strengthen wind. Now, the other trick to making this all happen is the right size for the job. I have an economist book of the year on this subject called Smallest Profitable if you want the details. In 3 decades, Denmark, the leading practitioner, has shifted from centralized power plants in red, mainly burning coal, to a constellation of wind farms in blue, 86% locally owned, and combined heat power plants in brown, mainly burning agricultural waste. And at the same time, they've reorganized their grid as a cellular network of islandable microgrids that normally exchange power freely, but if the grid fails, they can disconnect fractally, continue to serve critical loads from local supplies, later resync, reconnect seamlessly. In Cuba, the same resilient grid architecture, with Chinese help, let them reduce their serious blackout days from 224 days in 2005 to 0 days in 2007. And then the next year, they had 2 hurricanes in 2 weeks, shred the eastern grid, and they still met critical loads. Now, in a nation urgently striving to modernize your power system, it may seem premature to discuss threats to the business model of electric utilities. But with India's technical and entrepreneurial genius bringing so much modernity so quickly, I think this is a good time to realize that disruptors are converging on the global electricity industry from at least 8 directions. Efficient use takes utilities' sales while renewables beat the supplies. Integrative design makes efficiency bigger and cheaper. Customer preferences can drive market choices. Invisibly optimizing when electricity is used and time-shifting supply through storage intensify the competition from distributed renewables. Rules can reallocate risks and reward. And some of the biggest changes come from new financing mechanisms and new business models. So think of these as the 8 Pac-Men of the apocalypse. They move fast, they hunt in packs, not singly, and they don't just add, they exponentiate. They multiply quickly, they feed on utility revenues, And together, they're creating an alien competitive landscape faster than most traditional utilities, cultures, and stakeholders can cope. In August 2014, all central thermal plants were called dinosaurs, too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long run. Who said that? Was it Greenpeace? No, it was Union Bank of Switzerland. And in India, too, dinosaurs could rapidly go extinct. So as electricity providers understandably focus on the need for price to exceed cost, let us not forget the other part of the business imperative that value must exceed price. If competitors offer a better value proposition and grab your customers and revenues, profitably running a traditional utility isn't good enough. And if you want to know how quickly the market can flip when conditions are right, here's a bit of automotive history from the US. On New York's Fifth Avenue in 1900, you have to look hard for the first car. 13 years later, you have to look even harder for what might be the last horse, and I'm not even sure there is a horse in this picture. The horse and buggy industry thought it had many decades to adapt, but Henry Ford made the Model T 62% cheaper in 13 years. The car-owning households soared tenfold from 8% to 80% in 10 years. 3/4 of them thanks to a financial innovation from General Motors and DuPont called car loans. Well, today solar modules just got 80% cheaper in 5 years with no end in sight. That's accelerating. 3/4 of California rooftop solar is innovatively financed, and Henry Ford's and Thomas Edison's industries are merging. So horse and buggy thinking is dangerous. It's still rather common. A former oilman, Murray Strong, said not all the fossils are in the fuel. But as the former chair of DuPont, Edgar Woolard, reminds us, firms hampered by old thinking won't be a problem because they simply won't be around long term. They're forgetting that the pace of transformation, as these pictures so clearly show, is set not by incumbents but by insurgents. Insurgents are not inhibited by the incumbents' business models, legacy assets, or cultures. And investors flee even before customers do, because capital markets keenly sniff out disruption. And once the capital markets think you're even in or even headed for the toaster, they don't wait for the toast to get done before they decapitalize you and invest in your successors. We see that in the share price of Solar City, which just became a utility, and how that's moved compared to Exelon, our fourth biggest utility. Or here's how an automotive startup called Tesla Motors gained half the market cap of General Motors while selling 0.6% as many cars. So today's energy transformation is not just fundamental, it's elemental. The first industrial revolution was the age of carbon. It created our prosperity and the world's mightiest industries from coal and oil and a bit of gas. But now the obsolete age of carbon is giving way to the modern age of silicon. Silicon microchips, telecoms, and software turn people from isolated to networked and systems from dumb to smart. Silicon power electronics make electricity convertible and precisely applicable, replacing fiery molecules with obedient electrons. And silicon solar cells enable the ascent of energy from mining the fires of hell to harvesting the breath and radiance of heaven. India has now taken one of the two big steps toward fire-free electricity. And if India pays as much attention to energy efficiency as to renewables, the day may yet come when a bold leader of India can say to coal and oil, as Gandhiji said to another mighty power that had overstayed its welcome, that it's time you left. Let me end with a focus on energy access. Some 1.2 billion people, a fourth of them in India, have family income around $2 a day or less, have no grid power, have little prospect of affording it if they get it. And these impoverished people pay $38 billion a year, 1/5 of the total global cost of lighting services, to produce very inefficiently 1/1000th of the world's light, with huge health problems and carbon emissions that would rank 8th among nations. But now these deprived people can banish darkness and teach their daughters and sons to read. An entrepreneurial woman in the village can sell or lease them an integrated photovoltaic, LED, high-temperature lithium battery, smart chip, lighting package like this Waka Waka, Swahili for shines brightly, which will shine 10 hours very brightly on one day's charge in the sun, or if I put it down to the fourth setting, 150 hours on one day's charge. And this gives a payback of weeks or months against kerosene lighting. So not buying that kerosene is like a perpetual annuity equal to a month's extra income per year. So there goes the last bit of John Rockefeller's 155-year-old kerosene business. Which of these two offerings is more exciting and lucrative and transformational? To which strategy would you entrust your company's fate and our common future? Your choice of electricity's disruptive future could just save the world, not at a cost, but at a profit. I want to thank you all for your good work and your kind and prolonged attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, sir. And ladies and gentlemen, Shri Pujari actually had to attend a very urgent ministry meeting, which is why he had to leave. But we have with us Dr. Rahul Tongia, who has kindly consented to take his place. He's the advisor for ISGF and also fellow Brookings India. Please welcome him with a big hand.